I would like to take this opportunity before beginning the first of my 3 lectures to thank the Swedenborg Society for giving me this opportunity. I particularly want to thank Executive Director Stephen McNeely, Editor James Wilson, and Events Coordinator Avery Curran for helping me. To these 3 and to the rest of the staff, I offer my heartfelt thanks. Anytime I give a lecture on the subject of Swedenborg, I feel that I have a responsibility to state that while I am a great admirer of this man, particularly his critique of the ecclesiastical and dogmatic aspects of Christianity, as well as his critique of Cartesian philosophy, that I am not a Swedenborgian. I grew up in a very Catholic family where I enjoyed 8 years of the Sisters of St. Joseph and 6 years of Jesuit education at Georgetown University and John Carroll before completing my education at the University of Maryland. It was during my junior year at Georgetown when I enrolled in a course of existentialism that led to my eventual decision to leave Roman Catholicism and also Christianity. I am a secular humanist who nevertheless remains fascinated with religions of all types and descriptions. As a historian of American thought and medical humanities, I find myself immersed in religion, from the Puritans and mainline Protestant denominations to Unitarians, Christian Science, Buddhism, New Thought, and even Scientology. My intent today, and I hope you will find it worthwhile, is to recount how I became interested in Swedenborg. Also, as I was preparing these lectures, I asked myself if I could identify at least 3 individuals who, in one way or another, played a role in each of my books on Swedenborg. Until I get there, I will leave it to you to maybe figure out who they might be. I want to begin, however, by saying that it took me 42 years in my academic career before I became interested in Emanuel Swedenborg. During those years, I had certainly come across his name, but usually it was in the form of a footnote or a passing remark. I can't recall ever reading a paragraph about Swedenborg, much less a chapter or a book. The fact is, I never gave him more than a passing notice and didn't take the time to examine his background or his influence. It wasn't until the early 1990s when I became interested in the history of alternative and complementary medicine that I found him mentioned frequently by the faculty who taught in their medical colleges. I discovered at that time, and to my surprise, that many of these faculty were Swedenborgians. And that got my curiosity. Was it simply a coincidence, or was there another reason for it? The answer came fairly quickly, as I knew that nearly all of alternative schools of healing profess a belief in vitalism, meaning that the energy or force which creates and sustains life comes from outside the material universe. This is distinct from materialism, which argues that all that exists is matter, which even consciousness is derived. Both vitalism and materialism hold different views of disease. The vitalist often explains disease as a blockage or imbalance of this energy force. For example, the early chiropractors and osteopaths believed that by manipulating the subluxations along the spine, They could draw energy from the universe and distribute it in various parts of the body to correct ills. The materialist, on the other hand, claims that purely physical or chemical imbalances in the molecular structure of the body can explain the causes of disease. This has become the foundation for conventional, or what we call reductionist medicine. But my focus is on vitalism, not materialism. In my examination of the vitalist healing process, I discovered that there was both a secular side to it as well as a spiritual side. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, the energy source for the secular side of vitalism was thought to originate with Anton Mesmer's theory of animal magnetism. For Mesmer, a German physician, animal magnetism filled the ether and was the medium through which light, heat, and electricity traveled from one object to another. Mesmer believed that this fluid required an even distribution throughout the universe for it to remain in equilibrium, and that included the human body as well. This meant that the free flow or blockage of this magnetism could make the difference between health and disease. On the religious side of vitalism, or the spiritual side of vitalism, we find Swedenborg, whose energy source also came from outside the material universe. Swedenborg identified this energy source as divine influx, or God's love. In his cosmology, it was the divine influx rather than animal magnetism that filled the cosmos. And it was this divine spirit or influx that endowed matter with life. So why is this important? It is important because Mesmer's animal magnetism and Swedenborg's divine influx offered two competing sources for how medicine worked. One secular, the other spiritual. On the secular side of alternative medicine, we find among the many 18th and early 19th century healers the Prenopaths, the Thomsonians, Andrew Jackson Davis's Harmonialists, the early homeopaths, the early chiropractors, and the early osteopaths. Also, we find Madame Blavatsky's Theosophy and Barbara Brennan's high energy healing. On the spiritual side of alternative medicine, most of which were popular in the late 19th and early 20th century, we see the homeopathy of James Tyler Kent and James John Garth Wilkinson. We see Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy, Elwood Worcester's Emmanuel movement, Christian spiritualism, Phineas Quimby's mind cure, and Mary Baker Eddy's Christian Science. Now, my desire to trace the history of these two traditions led to my first two books on Swedenborg, Swedenborg, Mesmer, and the Mind-Body Connection, and the history of New Thought, from mind cure to positive thinking to the prosperity gospel. So what about the book Distant Voices, Sketches of a Swedenborgian Worldview? How did that book come about? As I read further into the works of Swedenborg and reading what others wrote about him, I came across a quote by Emerson that took me by surprise. In it, Emerson described the first half of the 19th century as the age of Swedenborg. He also, in his book Representative Men, which he published in 1850, counted Swedenborg among Western society's 6 greatest thinkers and doers. What I interpreted from Emerson's remark was that there was an alignment of Swedenborg's mysticism with the period's embrace of idealism. And that got me to thinking. What if I could identify a dozen or so gifted individuals from both Great Britain and from the United States who were in some fashion responsible for the spread of his ideas? Moreover, what if I could identify individuals who, like Swedenborg, helped change the world intellectually, artistically, and even materially? I began looking for individuals whose behavior was much like Swedenborg, who had embraced the possibility of change without using destructive methods, who possessed a social conscience that for the most part avoided public melodrama and acrimonious debate, who demonstrated it as a desire to share their ideas with ever-widening audiences, and whose writings expressed confident assurance that individual and societal goals were attainable, that benevolence was a common impulse among all classes, that metaphysical speculation was wasteful energy, and that improvement of mankind through individual and communal effort was not only possible, but necessary. I wanted to find in them a mood of optimism, pointing out that progress no longer required denominational or doctrinal uniformity. I wanted to find in them a belief that the nation was a kind of soul which demanded an awakening or revival. Now, after looking at dozens of people, I chose 12. Henry James Sr., who transformed Swedenborgianism into Christian socialism. Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was the poet-priest of transcendentalism. Charles Fourier and Albert Brisbane, who influenced the Brook Farm experiment, which eventually transitioned into a Swedenborgian community. Thomas Lake Harris, whose combination of Swedenborg and his own idiosyncratic mysticism led to several utopian societies, which interestingly called themselves the Uses. James John Garth Wilkinson and James Tyler Kent, who took Swedenborg into homeopathic medicine, making it both a religion and a medical healing system. Charles Boney, who organized the World's Parliament of Religions at the Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893, and who brought the world's religious leaders together for the first time in modern times. Ralph Waldo Trine, one of the leaders of the New Thought movement. Paul Karras and Herman Vettering, who facilitated the importation of Buddhism into the United States and who considered Swedenborg as having Buddhist roots. And lastly, the Zen scholar D.T. Suzuki, who called Swedenborg Buddha's counterpart in the Western world. As I examined these individuals, I found that I could connect each of them not only to Swedenborg, but to each other. I was reminded of the theory of 6 degrees of separation, namely that all living and non-living things are connected by 6 or less steps, which is based on the premise that as social and technological networks expand, the actual distance between them becomes smaller. But that really was not my purpose. Instead, my purpose was to find individuals who were intent on liberating humankind from its self-love, or what Swedenborg called proprium. To be precise, I was looking for people who harbored a reformer's bias based on Swedenborg's doctrine of uses by contributing to the greater good. It was Swedenborg who wrote, and I quote, "The universe has been created by God that uses might come into existence, and therefore the universe may be called a theater of uses," unquote. To explain this, I want to introduce you to the first of the 3 individuals who played a role in each of my books on Swedenborg. My first individual is the theologian Henry James Sr., who was born in Albany, New York, the son of wealthy Irish immigrants. His father made a fortune investing in land along the Erie Canal and became one of the wealthiest men in America at the time. He left his 9 children unburdened by having to work for a living, which is to say that James and his family were able to live comfortably. But instead of entering into the business world or frittering away his wealth in self-indulgence, James matriculated at Princeton Theological Seminary only to be repelled by the doctrine of human depravity, which he could no longer in good conscience accept. In 1843, while in England, James experienced a profound religious epiphany that an acquaintance friend diagnosed as vastation, a term employed by Swedenborg to explain the early stages of purification that accompanies religious illumination. As a result of this diagnosis, James became fascinated with Swedenborg's writings and ultimately dedicated himself to the task of replacing Christianity's archaic dogmas with the Swedenborgian conception of God and his religion to humanity. From the mid-1840s onward, James produced a steady stream of theological and philosophical works that included titles like What Constitutes the State, Moralism in Christianity, The Nature of Evil, The Social Significance of Our Institutions, Substance and Shadow, The Secret of Swedenborg, and Society, the Redeemed Form of Man. Now, what I found most interesting in the titles of his books was that he made it his life's work to explain not just the problem of evil and the concept of free will, but also the nature of state and society and the promise of democracy. In other words, he made it a point not just to apply Swedenborg to the world of religion and metaphysics, but to the secular world. And in doing so, he labored to discover the meaning of self, of God, and of society. James saw his task as restoring the faith of apostolic Christianity, unencumbered by the rituals of ecclesiasticism or what he called sacramental magic. Against the backdrop of an age that still believed in the extremes of Calvinism, with its doctrines of salvation for the few and damnation for the many. James placed his faith in a spiritually democratic society that excluded no one from his vision of humanity. Influenced by the utopian socialism of Fourier, he also showed great interest in the success of the Brook Farm experiment and supported its transition into a Swedenborgian community. By any definition, James was a complex individual whose spiritual needs and belief in the moral equality of man and the fellowship of community outweighed all other demands of life. That said, James's interpretation of Swedenborg puzzled and exasperated both critics and admirers alike. Though he considered himself a follower of Swedenborg and wrote the book The Secret of Swedenborg as proof, his was an interpretation that defied contemporary viewpoints. In many ways, he became the unofficial spokesperson for those Swedenborgians who, like himself, chose to remain outside the new church. The journalist and editor of the New York Evening Post, Edwin Godkin, was fond of explaining that James belonged to a branch of Swedenborgianism to which he was the only member. Some called him a Swedenborgian, others a modified Swedenborgian, and still others called him a socialist. I found that none of these descriptions captured the full measure of the man. As I studied his works, I sensed that he viewed democracy as an instrument through which individuals would be able to unite what Swedenborg identified as their inward and outward lives. In a series of lectures that he delivered in New York in 1850 and 1851, James celebrated democracy as marking the end of humanity's puberty. While still imperfect, democracy affirmed the sovereignty of the people and the purpose of democratic government, which was to proclaim the unity of man. It introduced a spirit of optimism into the body politic that later reformers like Edward Bellamy, Henry Demarest Lloyd, Henry George, Lyman Abbott, and Walter Rauschenbusch would find appealing. What James was advocating was not just democracy, but Christian socialism, which he saw as replacing the randomness of a chaotic universe with a spirituality focused on redeeming humanity from its selfishness and moving towards selfless love. James called this divine, natural humanity. I found James to be a delightful eccentric who introduced what can best be called a philosophy of theopragmatism, which is to say that he stressed the natural world as the realm of use for the power and purpose of the divine spirit. James left a huge imprint on American thought that filtered through his two sons, Henry James, the novelist, and William James, the psychologist and philosopher. The second person who I chose is Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was arguably America's most quoted writer through the second half of the 19th and the first third of the 20th century. As literary critic Alfred Kazin once noted, Emerson served as the teacher of the nation, as his essays and lectures made an indelible imprint at a time when questions of philosophy, theology, and society stood foremost in the minds of his fellow Americans. Emerson has been depicted as the authentic representative of the nation's collective ideals. From his Phi Beta Kappa address, The American Scholar, to his essay on Man, the Reformer, this poet-philosopher demonstrated a gift for imparting values to a generation struggling to find its moral compass. Though labels of one type or another have been used to capture his psyche, the simple fact is that he does not fit any one definition for any extended length of time. He was an eclectic thinker, adrift in the canon of Western literature, as well as those he happened to discover from translations of Oriental philosophy and religion. He was also an honest thinker, molded by nearly 2 centuries of Puritan descent, offset by the virtues of individualism and self-reliance. He offered a treasury of insight into the workings of American politics and culture. And from his lectern to the printed page, he radiated the spirit of an invigorated new American. Above all else, he celebrated the individual whose voyage to self-discovery and self-reliance resulted in an optimistic and affirmative commitment to the realization of a good society. He challenged conventional truths. He advocated for a broader view of life and duty. He inspired a culture to experiment in creative democracy. And he retained throughout his life a filial duty to both his Creator and to the brotherhood of mankind. With essays such as Nature, Self-Reliance, The Oversoul, Manners, and Experience, Emerson demonstrated the ability to intuit the mood of the nation. As America's poet, priest, and oracle, he marked the turning point in the nation's literary independence from the old world. He was an all-American romantic whose words played well upon his audiences. But, as James Russell Lowell observed, and I quote, "We do not go to hear what Emerson says so much as to hear Emerson," unquote. What Lowell meant was that people found comfort in his words, whether they understood them or not. For in them was an inner wholeness that left people satisfied, if only for a time. Whether it was his essay on nature or his poem, Ode to Beauty, his words were strung together in such a way that they gave expression to emotions and needs long felt. Using the Lyceum, the Boston Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, and its London affiliate, as well as the Dial, Atlantic Monthly, and other print mediums, he shared his insight with the world around him. In 1845, Emerson lectured on Swedenborg or the Mystic as part of his Representative Men series given under the auspices of the Boston Lyceum and later published as a book in 1850. In his choice of 6 men, Plato, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Napoleon, Goethe, and Swedenborg, Emerson extolled the virtues and uses of these great thinkers and doers who represented different aspects of humanity. What drew Emerson to Swedenborg was his ability to find meaning in the universe without stopping first to check a catechism or obtain a priest's approval. Swedenborg demonstrated the ability to break through the ecclesiastical barriers constructed by religion. Both Emerson and Henry James lived through the tumultuous period of the Civil War, out of whose frayed social and political fabric they shared a mutual suspicion of tradition and authority. While they insisted that individuals belonged to something greater than themselves, neither could accept the fact that this greater thing could be found in the existing institutions of church and state. Though both men were similar in their goals, James felt more at home in his Swedenborgian theology, while Emerson, having vacated his pulpit at Boston's Second Church, roamed far and wide in his search for meaning. For Emerson, the genius of Swedenborg had been wasted unnecessarily by attaching himself to Christian symbols. For himself, Emerson showed little restraint in his intellectual travels, many of which drew from Oriental philosophy and religion. Still, the two men remained friends until their deaths in 1882. As I mentioned earlier, my intention has been to identify at least 3 individuals in my books whose ideas changed the world intellectually, artistically, and materially. And now I want to add a 3rd individual, James's son, the philosopher and psychologist William James, whose contributions bridged the 19th and 20th century. The intellectual historian Arthur O. Lovejoy once wrote that William James and Emerson were the 2 most influential writers in American philosophy, and the only 2 with wide international standing, leaving generations of disciples to carry forward their ideas. Emerson's complete writings were among William James's most treasured books and became the stepping-off point for his eventual belief system. James read Emerson not just out of general interest or curiosity, but because he was the nation's intellectual godfather. Throughout his life, James praised the pragmatic Emerson, but disapproved the transcendentalist. What James liked most of Emerson's writings was the interaction of his thought with experience. When, however, his words got lost in billowy clouds, James lost interest. It was not that he disapproved of Emerson's ideals or his ends, but that the abstractness of those ideals seemed unnecessary. As champions of individualism and the instrumental application of thought to action, both Emerson and James offered a fresh alternative to dogmatic philosophizing. Both viewed the mind as an active instrument in the body's interaction with its environment. When you add James's father to Emerson and William James, and the fact that each was influenced by Swedenborg, the question becomes why. I think what made these 3 individuals so important was the fact that each carried their empathy and imagination into public life. They emphasized the importance of collective improvement, love, and the notion of service. And like Swedenborg, they refused to live in a closed universe. Instead, they were forever challenging the intellectual boundaries with bold new perspectives. They sought a type of wisdom that distanced themselves from the sectarianism of their age by valuing the imagination and not the impoverished vocabulary of accepted notions. They were extraordinarily gifted men in asking questions that turned on what it meant to be human, which is to say that their questions went to the very heart of personal and collective morality. Rather than accepting the reigning worldview, they sought to challenge, revise, and reinvent the religious and secular beliefs of the age. This was the legacy they left us. It was that understanding that caused me to write my most recent book, Swedenborg's Principles of Usefulness, Social Reform Thought from the Enlightenment to American Pragmatism. I do hope it is a book that you might like to read, as it closes the loop, so to speak, on what Swedenborgianism has meant to me. The book reinforces the common thread of correspondences and uses running not only through Swedenborg's theology and his metaphysics, but through the body politic of American society. Through Edward Bellamy's nationalist movement, the novels of William Dean Howe, Henry George's single tax theory, Lyman Abbott's The Brotherhood of Man, Washington Gladden's Applied Christianity, and William James's Meliorism. Each of these individuals advocated for peaceful forms of societal reconstruction, and each attempted to make every individual a potential agent of change. Central to their vision was a hopefulness that beliefs were rules for action, that truth was the outcome of humanity's doing, that democracy was open to change, and where plurality of experience ruled out the viciousness of extremes. The Swedenborgian doctrines of correspondences and uses found in American Reformed tradition the keys to unlocking the connection between actions and their deeper meaning. Here was the nexus of political volunteerism, moralism, and the readiness to challenge the status quo. Religion remained, but the old gods were exchanged for a secular spirituality that was as commanding as any god, but focused on human ideals and values. Preferred over all other theories, pragmatism emphasized self-reliance, individualism, insight, instinct, intuition, optimism, and practice. Swedenborg may still be only a footnote in many people's minds, but his beliefs were carried into the 20th century via the philosophy of pragmatism, which left humankind to build an ethic not of ends, but of means, valuing experience and man's imaginative vision of the ideal, all of which focused on the greater good, or as Swedenborg called it, the grand human. Thank you.